Thank
You're
you.
on.
Welcome to a new approach towards the story of Kirkcudbright smuggling companies. This is indeed an old theme because I studied John Bignell on the Isle of Man from 1993, Walter Luttridge at Carlisle from a similar date. The floppy disks with his letter books on them are dated 1997, and I discovered David Curry et al., as we'll hear later, in 2008. Oh, there's a full slide isn't on, never mind. First, some definitions. In the 18th century, smuggling included the illegal importation of uncustomed and contraband goods. Uncustomed goods hadn't paid customs or excise duties, like brandy or tobacco, that were run on shore in small boats. And contraband was an illegal import, like tea that hadn't been sourced from the English East India Company. A company was an organization that sells goods, to emphasize the goods or services, in order to make money. The term smuggling company is usually applied to small groups of local people combining together to share the importation of smuggled goods along the coast. Our smuggling companies are very different. They include William Thwaites and Co. of Dublin, the Kirkcudbright Company, and it really was called the Kirkcudbright Company, in partnership with Walter Luttridge of Whitehaven, Curry, Beck and Co., who were legal merchants, in inverted commas, in Kirkcudbright, John Park, David Curry and John Christian et al. Of Nantes, Roscoff and Guernsey, John Park, who went out to Rousseau in Dominica, John Christian of Ayr, David Curry of Newlaw, and briefly David Stewart of Perthshire, who were attempting to supply Kirkcudbright with high-quality rum. Sorry, the mouse isn't working well. Amongst this, there's a Campbellton subplot, because William Gordon was John Bignell's attorney, and William Gordon of Campbellton was also a member of the Kirkcudbright Company with Walter Luttridge. These people were merchants as opposed to the local people who were doing the smuggling. And a merchant is a person or company involved in wholesale trade, especially one dealing with foreign countries. And foreign is the emphasis here. Our story covers both sides of the smuggling period. Before 1765, when the Isle of Man acted as a storehouse, and small boats, classic Manx wherries, transported the uncustomed and contraband goods to the coast of the Irish Sea. After 1765, when the English government, determined to stop smuggling for all time, had purchased the so-called fiscal rights of the Duke of Atholl for £70,000. Now, I've gone completely mad over the Bank of England's exchange rate. So £70,000 today would be £10,792,899.12. Also known as revestment, in an attempt, as I said, to end the smuggling for all time. And now the contraband goods and the uncustomed goods came directly from Europe in heavily armed vessels, but they were still unloaded by fleets of small boats going out from the shore. To start with William Thwaites and Co. and John Bignell. Intrigued because his grandfather's name was Ramsay Bignell Moore, in 1993, Martin Moore gave me a copy of John Bignell's will and asked me to find out as much as possible about him. The resultant book, with the long title, The Life and Times of John Bignell, Merchant of Dublin, then of Douglas, and finally of Ramsay, Isle of Man, was not published until 2012. But by that time, I was able to add a considerable amount of valuable information from the archives at the Stewartry Museum. Bignell was born in Belturbet, County Cavan, where in 1967 I took my mother-in-law to pick strawberries. without appreciating how significant this location would be in the future. By 1703, Bignell was a merchant in Dublin, before moving to Douglas on the Isle of Man by 1708, when the Manx merchant John Murray imported both white wine and tobacco on his behalf. He was living in Ramsey by 1716. I used to love smuggling chains. Anybody who's been to a lot of my courses in the past will find this familiar. So it was wonderful to be able to use a smuggling chain for John Bignell's activities. In 1717, he joined William Thwaites & Co. of Dublin. He became, it wasn't exactly a factor, but he was their merchant on the Isle of Man, but at the same time not a full partner in the company. He was on the Isle of Man from their viewpoint because he could access the cargoes coming to the island. He could purchase tobacco in Whitehaven, where he'd already been to purchase tobacco, and he travelled regularly to Scotland to visit his customers and now their customers and to collect debts. And John Malcolm and John Stewart, merchants in Kirkcudbright, were both his customers. But mistrusting John Bignell, William Thwaites & Co. established William Towers as their agent in Douglas, basically to find out what John Bignell was up to all the time. The Articles of Agreement between William Thwaites & Co. and John Bignell, dated 7th of July 1717, haven't survived, but their details were discussed in court on the island, so it's possible to reconstruct some of the clauses. John Bignell must find new customers in Cumberland and southwest Scotland. He will be paid a commission of 2.5% on all the goods that he sold. His expenses will be paid on journeys to purchase tobacco or to visit the company's customers in Scotland, and he must keep a book of account that could be inspected by William Thwaites or Michael Sampson in Dublin or by Henry Towers at a moment's notice. There were 2 subsequent letters confirming aspects of John Bignell's role in the partnership. According to a letter dated 29th August 1717, he had power to transact any purchase of brandy or any other affair of that nature on the island. Some of this brandy came from Bordeaux, and at Douglas in 1717, he imported 63 puncheons containing over 6,000 gallons of brandy and 5 hogsheads of wine on board the John of Dublin, John Doyle Master. The brandy would be repackaged into 10-gallon or 5-gallon casks, so that this importation might fill 600 10-gallon casks or 1,200 5-gallon casks. And this gives us some idea of the level of his trade, remembering at the same time that this was only one of his importations to the island that year. Another letter, dated the 13th of February 1718, stated that Bignell was expected to use the company as well as he could when purchasing tobacco in Whitehaven. That meant to obtain the best quality at a reasonable price. The tobacco came from Virginia and Maryland in America. It had to be transported from the plantations in America in British bottoms or vessels and imported into Britain before it could be sent anywhere else. Look at the size of these barrels of tobacco and imagine trying to smuggle them in a small boat onto the shore. This meant that for tobacco smuggling, the tobacco was imported into Britain first and paid import duties. Then it was exported again when the duties were refunded, known as drawback. Bignell was importing tobacco from Whitehaven into the Isle of Man, as we've already said, before William Thwaites & Co. took him on as one of their factors. It would be repackaged into smaller containers ready to be transported to the Scottish and Cumbrian shores. So Bignell travelled from the island to Whitehaven on behalf of William Thwaites and Co. at 5 guineas a trip, and to contact their customers north of the Solway at 7 guineas a trip. And these are his expenses from 1718 to 1722. So he was quite busy. Over the 5 years between 1717 and 1722, Bignell's commission totalled over £92 sterling, £17,766. So that at least 3,680 or over £710,000 worth of goods had been sold. In other words, he was successful in what he was doing. And John Malcolm, a merchant in Kirkcudbright, was one of John Bignell's private customers. On the 5th of March 1735, Malcolm wrote to John Bignell with an order of spirits, etc., totalling £48, 1 shilling and a farthing, and delivered safely by Thomas Bailey, boatmaster in Ramsey. I've realised that sum actually, in the sum, I must have missed something off. But anyway, £49, 1 shilling and a farthing. According to John Bignell's executors, this account was still unpaid at Bignell's death. Now, there are interesting things in that order, because it included brandy, rum, tea and coffee, quite a mixed lot. Coffee is the plant on the far left in this diagram, and it was grown in plantations on the higher ground in the West Indies. I've studied coffee plantations in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, but although I've looked at the images, there wasn't anything appropriate. But these are plans of Jamaican coffee plantations. And there'll be further information about the sources of tea and rum when we come to David Curry et al. Later on. But John Bignell didn't actually get his coffee from Jamaica. He brought it from Bordeaux. So presumably it had been landed there from French islands in the West Indies. Captain John Stewart was a merchant in Kirkcudbright. He's listed as renting a warehouse there in 1737. And he lived southeast of the town on the road to Tours. That works as a pointer, isn't that marvellous? And the only clue as to the location is from evidence given by his daughter Sarah when she's describing a landing of contraband at Manxman's Lake. Now, I have tried and tried and tried in the past to find exactly where the Stuarts lived. And having failed to do this from the land, I then took to the sea in 2001. But I still couldn't work out where the house was, where they lived. Anyway, when John Bignell's executors finalised the accounts in 1749, Captain Stewart still owned £20, now £3,850. The story of the affair between John Bignell and Sarah Stewart, John Stewart's daughter, and the resultant baby is going to be discussed by me to the Dumfries and Galloway Family History Society next week. It didn't seem quite appropriate as company business this week. One more of John Bignell's Kirkcudbright customers was Samuel Gordon of Knockbrex, who owed John Bignell £150 at an annual interest rate of £7 10 shillings. And in addition, William, his son, had signed a form to say that if this bill wasn't paid, he would add another £100. Then his father died, so the bill wasn't paid. So William was arrested and imprisoned in the toll booth, or firm warding place, therein to remain on his own proper charges and expenses until he had paid what was owed. On 26th of December 1727, William Gordon of Campbellton, as John Bignell's attorney, allowed the prisoner to be liberated. And with that liberation, we stopped talking about John Bignell and his connections with Kirkcudbright, and move on to Walter Lutwidge and the Kirkcudbright Company, which, as I said before, he really called it the Kirkcudbright Company. When I worked on Walter Lutwidge's letterbooks to begin with, they were housed at the castle in Carlisle. The record office was a quite extraordinary place. You had to go through army barracks to get to it. It's now, and I've never worked at the new building, but it's now in Carlisle itself, and there's a splendid building bottom right. Anyway, I found the two letterbooks, Walter Lutwidge's two letterbooks, quite fascinating because they covered all his dramatic activities between 1739 and 1741 and 1746 and 1749. So very enthusiastically, because I'd just finished a book about George Moore, a merchant on the Isle of Man, I wrote my book about Walter Lutwidge. Having written the book and preparing to publish it, I asked the archivist in the castle, what should I say? How should I refer to the letterbooks in the bibliography? And he said, but you can't write about them. They're only lodged here. They're not deposited. You need permission before you can write about them. I never thought you'd finish the book. Thank you very much. So started the hunt to find the person who had lodged the letterbooks at the Carlisle Record Office. And I soon discovered that he was dead. But I was told that I would have to contact his wife because she now owned the letterbooks and she should be able to give me permission to write my book, all being well. But she was living in a commune in mid-Wales. My stepdaughter had been in a commune outside Shrewsbury, so I contacted somebody there and said, do you by any chance have a list of all the communes in mid-Wales? And it took us a weekend to visit all of them, and his wife wasn't there. And so I was completely defeated about writing the book, which has never been printed. But at this stage, the archivist did say that he was sure I could refer to the information in the letter book, in publications, just so long as I didn't write a whole book about them. So that was my introduction to Walter Lutwidge. Now, part of his house still exists in Whitehaven. He was very successful. He'd been encouraged by his uncle to go from Dublin to live in Whitehaven because the tobacco business was so wonderful. And as part of his splendid house, he had these gates on the right and a long railings. And I measured how long the railings should be, because in the 19th century, the gates and railings were put up for auction, and they've landed up at Glan-Severn in Wales. And this is where we took a photograph of them some long time ago now. Walter Lutwidge owned a fleet of tobacco ships, and they took essential supplies out to America, returning with tobacco. He set up a whole lot of factors in stores along the main rivers in Maryland, and they would sell the cargoes delivered there by the ships and look out for the best tobacco. And this best tobacco was sent home. Basically, this is not Whitehaven, but it was sent home originally to Whitehaven. So at first, all Walter Lutwidge's ships went to Whitehaven, but he didn't sell any of his tobacco locally. It was either exported or carried overland to Scotland or northeast England. And the customs officers in Whitehaven were highly suspicious of what he was getting up to. And he found the constant peering over his shoulder, as it were, about, well, where did that tobacco come from? And why are you sending that there? And haven't we seen this tobacco before? Was getting too much for him. So he decided he would move up to Kirkcudbright with his trade, because he already knew 4 of the merchants there and got on very well with them. And he would send Robert Armstrong as his agent to live in Kirkcudbright and look after the ships when they came and export the tobacco or send it overland wherever it was going. Because Walter Lutwidge's first letter book starts in 1739, we don't know when he first started sending his tobacco ships to Kirkcudbright. We do know that he was renting a warehouse there in 1736, and that the Cockermouse, Joseph Fleming master, was lost near here in 1737, because the resultant court case was still going on in 1739. So what happened to this tobacco is exactly the same as Whitehaven. In 1739, the Nelly, John Forbes master, carried 50 hogsheads to Rotterdam, where it would be sent to the Isle of Man, repackaged and run on shore in Scotland. Quite a journey, and yet the uncustomed tobacco was still cheaper than it would have been if it had been purchased legally, having come directly from Virginia and Maryland, which I think is one of the best examples of how ridiculously high import duties and other taxes were. Walter Lutwidge also supplied the northeast of England with tobacco sent by carrier. This is his letter dated the 26th of September 1739 to Leonard Ward of Darlington. I wrote my agent at Kirkcudbright to send you 12 packs of tobacco, and as that sells, shall send more. In case you can't get 8p or £6 per pound 6 months credit, or 7 3/4 ready money, don't sell. It ought to fetch 8.5p credit and 8 1/4 ready money. And if the quality be chosen, as I believe it is, that was high quality, it ought to fetch more, but your prudence will direct you. Pray advise me when you receive it and sell it off on arrival, if possible, to make way for more. For it's no purpose to send more before it's sold. You are to pay the carriers 12 shillings per pack for carriage on delivery, and mind to advise me if there be any of the weight wanting. In other words, he didn't trust anybody. Robert Armstrong sent Lutwidge a letter explaining the situation of the tobacco still at Kirkcudbright and what had been sent to the northeast. And on the 1st of July 1740, Lutwidge replied, "You have no more proper tobacco to send, I see. Mr. Cookson of Newcastle complains much of the last," and Mr. Cookson subsequently became Walter Lutwidge's son-in-law. In fact, Walter Lutwidge was already winding up his business in Kirkcudbright. On the 19th of November 1739, he wrote to William Gordon of Campbellton, "I assigned and sold my son my ships, the Brothers, and her cargo of tobacco, and what other effects I have in trade, being resolved to retire." So in 1739, the Mary and Betty, Joseph Fleming master, he'd been the master of the Cockermouse that was lost near Kirkcudbright, was due to take her tobacco to Kirkcudbright. But because the winds were from the northeast, and he didn't want to get into this kind of a situation, instead he took the vessel to Whitehaven. And the Brothers, Henry Dixon master, which now belonged to Walter Lutwidge's son Thomas, was diverted to Whitehaven. So basically his trade with them had stopped. James Patton had been a shipmaster for the Kirkcudbright Company, and when they sacked him because of a dispute over money, he told a tale of woe to Walter Lutwidge, who made him master of one of his own vessels. This was disastrous, as Lutwidge explained in a letter to the Dutch merchant Archibald Hamilton in Rotterdam. He wrote of Patton, "A rogue which I took out of the briars when his former owners fell out with him, for the same crimes which I charged him with. but they were ignorant and did not know where to lay their fingers. They laid them on the shadow and did not see the substance, which made me conclude that he had been ill-used by them, so advised them to give up their demands against him for money. The financial problems between Walter Lutwidge and James Patten became so severe that Patten was threatening to have any of his ships arriving in Virginia or Maryland searched for any goods on board that hadn't been taken on in Britain, and Lutwidge got badly bothered by all this. We were approached, after I finished this work, it was David Devereux was approached by somebody in America who was writing a paper about James Patten, and he turned his life round completely and became a famous merchant. Memory says it was a linen merchant, and I sent to them all the information that I had about, to quote Walter Lutwidge, a rotten egg he'd been, but that didn't actually appear in their paper. There were other problems with the Kirkcudbright Company, and Walter Lutwidge wrote to Thomas Kirkpatrick on the 29th of July, 1740. I can't help being astonished at the contents of your letter, as well as at the turns of thought which I have perceived in you for a long time past, which, in my humble opinion, was no ways convenient with your interest. But that's not my business to examine into. Lutwidge was particularly upset because of all the advantages that the Kirkcudbright Company had gained by him taking his trade there. For example, Thomas Kirkpatrick could send 70 hogsheads of his tobacco to Rotterdam for free. This had been greatly at my loss, said Lutwidge, because there had been no room on board for all his tobacco. Yet now Kirkpatrick was adding a charge to their account for the cost of actually loading tobacco onto a carrier's cart. Lutwidge continued, I see the moment you went off from my interest, and I have governed myself accordingly, as my conduct justifies. But it's the way of the world for people when they think they can do of themselves to grasp at all, and so lose all. I am sorry I should write this last to one whom I esteem so much as I do you, but I know what's right, and I know what one friend ought to do for another, and I know proper returns, and I know, had you been governed by me, it would have been better for both, and it's not yet too late, but if you resolve to go your way, I must do the same, and this you, Campbellton, and I will talk over at meeting. Despite this meeting between the three men, Walter Lutwidge did not persuade his son to send his trade to Kirkcudbright. One rather, flippant isn't quite the right word, interesting letter towards the end of his letters to Kirkcudbright was dated the 9th of March 1740, and it was to the member of the Kirkcudbright Company, David Mowat. And Walter Lutwidge writes, Mr. Armstrong tells me you are upon the point of matrimony with sweet Nicky, a choice like your usual, and a choice, if I had any knowledge in progeny, will make you the happy father of a race that will give you comfort in your own days and hand down to posterity that inner integrity which has forever appeared in the father. Don't think that this arrives from the usual flights that proceed from one friend to another, but from a real knowledge, which I have had of one who has really made himself dear to me by that conduct. I shan't add that I most truly wish you as much satisfaction and comfort in your matrimonial state as I myself has enjoyed, which has been the motive that has for near 30 years past sweetened all the plagues and crosses which I have from time to time met with, some of which you have been an eyewitness of. In other words, not a happy commentary on his time with Kirkcudbright. Without flattery, Pretty Nicky is, so far as I had an opportunity of observing, so like my wife, that had I authority or influence, I should, of all the women I see in North Britain, have recommended her to my friend. I sometimes dream about retiring, like Walter Lutwidge did, and one of my dreams is that I will then try and find out David Mowatt's family history and see what happened to his progeny. And so we leave Walter Lutwidge, who's gone back to Whitehaven. And we move on to our post-revestment smuggling company in Kirkcudbright. Well, how did this all start? We had an exhibition of the plants growing at Kirkcudbright Garden in the 19th century at this first festival of gardening and country life. And on the Saturday, there was a gusting wind, and I went into Castle Douglas for extra guy ropes so that our gazebo wouldn't take off. And when I returned, Francis Maxwell, who was with us, was struggling with his new banner of arms that had been flying over the gazebo. And for the first time, I looked at it properly, and it said Maxwell of Kirkcudbright and New Law. So I said to Francis, where's New Law? And he waved his arm over the hill that you can see, top left, and he said, over there. Well, the next Monday, I was at the National Records in Edinburgh, and I looked at the catalogue for New Law and discovered to my confusion what I thought was a double entry, but it wasn't. It was 2 volumes of the most amazing document that tells us the tragic story of David Curry of New Law. So the rest of our story is dominated by David Curry and John Park. So John Park, originally from Beath in Ayrshire, was the cashier to the Douglas firm of Ross, Black and Christian. That was David Ross, who was Scottish from this area, Robert Black, who was Irish, and John Christian, who was Manx. And they were major smuggling merchants in Douglas. And as I say, John Park was their cashier. David Curry of New Law had met John Park in the earlyish 1760s, and they had gone into partnership together. This happened so much, although John Park was cashier for Ross, Black and Christian, he was also in partnership with David Curry in the smuggling trade, supplying Kirkcudbright. So that in 1765-66, we see them still busy. Now, I quote a lot from Adam McWonnell, who had himself been involved in a tobacco manufactory on the Isle of Man and smuggling the tobacco onto the Scottish coast. But he joins the David Curry Beck company, but he doesn't like his partners, nearly all of whom are ex-smugglers, but he doesn't like them, and he does a wonderful critical attack on them all, so that we quote him whenever we want something nasty said about John Park and Co. And this is the first comment, and he says, in late 1765 and early 1766, David Curry and John Park were still carrying on an unlawful business with the Isle of Man in order to wind up their affairs there. So these are the smuggling companies in Kirkcudbright after revestment, and I'm calling them all Kirkcudbright because Curry, Beck and Co were definitely Kirkcudbright. They were set up in Kirkcudbright, but David Curry of New Law and Kirkcudbright was also involved in these 3 subsequent companies, and also a 4th company which finally came to a sticky end. So looking at the first company, this is their contract of co-partnership. And the green arrows indicate people who had already got connections with the Isle of Man and with the smuggling trade. Only Andrew Muir of Newton Stewart and Hugh Blair, the young man of Dunrod, had not been involved in the smuggling trade. But in theory, these were all ex-smugglers who wanted to set up a legal trade in Kirkcudbright to earn the sort of money that they'd been earning when they were smuggling. So we have some of their terms of reference. To trade in and carry on any kind of lawful merchandise and manufacture that they might judge most for the benefit and interest of the concerned, for and during the space of 15 years from and after the 1st of January 1766. That meant they were supposed to be going on until 1781. And they were to have a joint and equal stock or capital of £4,000 each of the 8 partners, £500 of which was to be paid by the following January or as soon afterwards as possible. And according to McWonnell, by the words of the contract, smuggling or dealing in the importation of contraband goods was expressly excluded. In fact, the main work that they were going to get involved with, first of all, was Baltic trade. And they dealt with, we've got the list at the top of the list, you've got the ports they were dealing with, and the second half of the list, you've got the goods that were being imported into Kirkcudbright that all look very good and very above board, and certainly they had set up a legal business of ex-smugglers, yes. And the other thing that the company was going to be involved with was the West India trade. And that was if they found somebody suitable enough to send out to the West Indies and set up a base there and send the rum back to Kirkcudbright. The problem with all these things, from the tobacco, why Walter Luttridge had his own stores in Maryland, why they wanted somebody in the West Indies, was if you didn't have an eye on what you were importing, it could be very poor quality. So the West Indies meant rum more than coffee, so it basically meant rum. Now, this is one of my frustrations. I've only ever managed to find 9 of the 10 views in the island of Antigua that were painted by William Clark in 1823, because I think they give us a splendid impression of what it was like there. And the top image is obviously the rum distillery, and lower down, again, large containers, like the tobacco containers, going into a small boat to take it out to a ship to export it. This is the famous John Paul Jones importation of rum into Kirkcudbright on the John of Dumfries from Jamaica. And it was thought that because there was a John Beck in Whitehaven, that this was actually a Whitehaven ship that had gone to Kirkcudbright by mistake. But in fact, no, it was definitely a ship that was going to our Kirkcudbright company of Curry, Beck and Co. for themselves. And you've got a list here of what was on board, which was mahogany timber and cotton and sugar, pimento, but also there was rum on board. And this, I've gotten a mess today over the dates, but anyway, I always thought that this was the exportation of that rum, because instead of staying in Kirkcudbright, it was sent to, on the Neptune of Kirkcudbright, it was sent to Elsinore in Denmark, where it would be repackaged into small containers and run back onto the coast. So it was a smuggling game. Now, Adam McWonnell claimed that at the end of 1766, he was asked if he wanted to be concerned in smuggling, and he expressly refused because it was a legal company. It was supposed to be doing legal things in Kirkcudbright. it wasn't. At this stage, all the tea came from the Canton district in China. You see it says very firmly, best tea comes from that part of the world. And I love this picture of a tea plant. It always fascinates me that so many different tea types are produced from the one plant. Well, at Canton, they were very well organized, and the hongs, or warehouses there, were run by Chinese merchants who put up a flag to say which of the European East India companies they were ready to deal with. And there was the English East India Company that tried desperately to supply the total tea trade to the UK, but didn't. But also, because the price of tea was so high, and because a very high proportion, 66% at the days of the Isle of Man, 80% by the 1770s, of the tea that was drunk in Scotland, England, Wales and Ireland had been smuggled. Several of the European East India companies only supplied British smugglers. That was the whole point of them trading with China, was to come back with tea, because often in the countries that was importing this tea, the population preferred to drink coffee anyway. So these are the hongs, and this is inside one of those hongs where Chao Kwa, a Chinese tea merchant, is getting the tea ready for one of the Danish Asiatic Company's ships that's going to take it back to Copenhagen. And Gothenburg is the main place that was used for by our people in Kirkcudbright, and they would go to the tea sales. Now, I must say that this is too late an image, 1890 for goodness sake. So it wouldn't have looked like that in the 18th century, but it's one of my favourite images of Gothenburg. Perhaps AI can convert all the ships. Yes. So in the top right-hand corner, we have a cargo list of Le Finland, Captain Charles Gustavus Ekberg, that belonged to the Swedish East India Company. And in 1763, they sent this cargo list to Hugh, my mind's gone blank, John Taubman on the Isle of Man, in case he wanted to send any ships to collect to purchase some of this. And in this list, they say that the Finland left Canton on the 19th of January, 1763. She was due at Stockholm on the 10th of August, and the sales would begin in Gothenburg on the 3rd of October 1763. And this is what the smugglers did. They went to Gothenburg and they bid for the tea that they wanted to subsequently smuggle. So in the spring of 1767, Curry Beck and Co. smuggled a large quantity of tea valued at over £3,000, £435,344, from on board the Briton Donald Ross Master from Gothenburg. The landing of so great a cargo of tea soon made a considerable noise over the whole country, and it reached the ears of the custom house officers. Remember the 8 people members of the Curry Beck and Co. Well, that 8 was supposed to include a cross-section of people, and young Hugh Blair of Dunrod, who was only 22 when he joined the company, had the most considerable estate and was worth the most money. So he was almost a partner for that reason. And when he was the one who was charged in the Court of Exchequer with the fine for importing the tea. And at first, his friends in Edinburgh managed to get the matter dropped, because he's a young man, he can't possibly have been involved with that. But when Curry Beck and Co. continued to smuggle tea, obviously, and when the huge cargo that had come in on the Briton continued to be the subject of general conversation over the whole country, Then in 1769, a writ was served against Hugh Blair for £10,000 or treble the value of the tea that had been smuggled. Now, it was always expected, it was never expected that anyone would actually pay that total amount. But what happened now was a game where you offered so much and said, well, I can't pay that much, but I can pay so much. And usually the court accepted, and then you had so many months or years to pay off the smaller amount. So in this case, Hugh Blair offered £800 instead of the £10,000. Plus, he paid in cash £50, which covered the court expenses. And he expected that some or all of the partners would come to his assistance, but none of them did. They just shrugged, he's got the money, he can pay it. And Adam McWonnell, yes, he's still making statements, reckoned that Curry, Beck and Co. wasn't involved in the tea smuggling anyway, because the voyage wasn't on their books. So that was a brilliant way of destroying a poor young man. In the meantime, John Park was restless, and so he had set up a series of companies in Europe, first at Nantes, then at Roscoff, and finally on Guernsey. And again, there were 8 people in the partnership. There was John Park, David Curry and John Christian. Now, John Christian, who had been the member of Ross Black and Christian in Douglas, after revestment, he'd gone to Ayr, where he became a merchant, and then he became cashier of the fated Douglas Heron Bank in Ayr. But at this stage, he thought he was in a good financial, strong position. So another of the members was John Taylor, who had been John Christian's clerk in Douglas, and he was finally sent off to run the base at Roscoff. And there were 4 other people. David Stewart had started as a member of Robert Herries and Co. in Barcelona, but he felt that John Park and Co. offered more interesting opportunities, so he agreed that he would pay his money to be a member of them. Alexander Keith, who set up at Nantes, Edward Coupland at Roscoff and then Guernsey, and one mention only of Hugh Cosnahan on the Isle of Man. And I do so wish that I could find out more about his membership and anything else he has to supply. So David Stewart writes to Herries and Co. and he says, we're based at Nantes now, and you know, we hope that you will come and help me and use us as your suppliers of tea at Lorient, because Lorient was the equivalent of Gothenburg for France. It was where the French East India Company ships arrived, and this is a painting of the town, and it's where John Park would go and purchase tea that was then smuggled from Nantes, Roscoff and Guernsey. So Stewart really hoped that Robert Herries would be involved. Now, Robert Herries himself is an interesting character. He was born at Holdykes, and he became a merchant first in Rotterdam and then in Spain at Barcelona. But at the same time, he got involved in banking. And he was, in fact, the person who invented the first traveller's cheque. So we should be thankful to him for that. So Robert Herries is in Paris when he writes to Robert Herries and Co., the bankers in London, and he says, of late, getting into correspondence with Park means with a parcel of smugglers, which we had better, I think, avoid, as discredit for such a house as ours. So here is a major smuggler saying that John Park and Co. are smugglers. Interesting. So by September 1771, John Park and Co. is based in Roscoff, but the tea still comes from Lorient. At first, this base was very successful, and this map shows where the different bases in the north coast of France, what part of the coast of southern England they were supplying. And Roscoff supplies from the tip of Cornwall as far as Portland Bill, and Guernsey actually a far wider area going right into Kent. Although there were now serious debts in Cornwall, it was a major problem. It had gone down from 30% profit to 50% loss. Yet another firm was set up on Guernsey. Now, all the time, these bases were being set up in Europe, although he was a partner in the companies, David Curry was sitting at New Law. Well, he was running his estate, but it's only a small estate, but he was still sitting at New Law. So they now start on something totally different. And to begin with, Stuart is involved, but then he luckily escapes from involvement. So it ends up just the three partners. And the idea is actually a very good one. They need money in the West Indies so that they can buy top quality rum to send to Kirkcudbright for the smuggling trade. And the best way that they can do that is by involving in the slave trade, because that means that they actually earn money in the West Indies, and then sitting there, they can know which are the best plantations and where to get the very best rum. So to explain very quickly the slave trade. Vessels loaded with goods for the West African coast in Liverpool. These goods were exchanged for slaves. And here we've just got one example of, in 1769, it's a completely different archive, but in 1769, on the 18th of July, Willie Honesty was paid with iron bars, kegs, various kinds of materials, and manillas, and knives, and tools, and rods for one man slave and one girl slave. So this was repeated time and time again until the ship was full of slaves. And here we have a picture of the notorious Brooks, which was supposedly so full of slaves that they could hardly move. Of course, there were bad slave captains, but when you think that the slaves were actually valuable, it was a highly valuable cargo, there were also good captains who kept the slaves as healthy as possible so that they would reach a good price when they got to the West Indies. And here, sitting at Rousseau in the West Indies, we have John Park, ready to buy cargoes of slaves off the slave ships coming across the Middle Passage from West Africa, and then he will sell the slaves to plantation owners on Dominica or on other West Indian islands, and that's where he makes his profit, and that's the profit that goes into buying the rum to be sent to Kirkcudbright. So in the last 6 months of 1775, 5 cargoes of slaves were purchased by John Park and Co., and they cost £24,698, 15 shillings and a quarter pence. Now, they had another person, Simon Fraser, in London, who dealt with all the financial matters. And so when these bills became due, he paid them to the merchants in Liverpool who'd sold their slaves to John Park and Dominica. But Simon Fraser was not reimbursed by John Park and Co. In fact, things were going very wrong. Instead of sending rum to Kirkcudbright, John Park was establishing bases on other West Indian islands, selling more slaves, and sending all the rum to New York that had an expanding market, and not paying his poor unfortunate partners anything. And yet Simon Fraser was saying, where's my money? Because I've paid these merchants in Liverpool for for their slaves. So where was David Curry? He was at New Law, quite happily, and that's a bit of his view. And he was at New Law writing letters to Simon Fraser about the ever worsening situation. 39 actually from New Law, 2 from Kirkcudbright, 2 from Dumfries, and 1 from Whitehaven. So we've got another of these pictures from the Hugh Crow book. We had one earlier. So they had many consultations in London between Simon Fraser, John Christian, and David Curry about John Park & Co.'s business in New York. And they decided that the answer was that David Curry should immediately set off for New York on the first available ship. In the meantime, David Curry had a connection out in America because his nephew, David Maitland from Barcaple, was now managing the affairs of the house at Dominica. Poor David Curry spent the last years of his life not at New Law, but in the Americas, desperately attempting to sort out what was happening to the rum and to obtain some money from John Park. And this is a list of the different places, indicates the different places where we believe that he went. And he did make contact with his nephew, David Maitland, but he couldn't produce any money, so it was impossible for him to help with what was becoming a more and more tragic situation. We think that David Curry died on St. Eustatius. It was on one of the West Indian islands where John Park & Co. carried on their co-partnering business, and he died in February 1782. It's a terrible thing to say, but luckily leaving enormous debts, because otherwise we wouldn't have this story about them all. John Park stayed in the West Indies and didn't remit any money to Simon Fraser back home. John Christian and his family were now in Dunkirk because the Douglas Heron Bank in Ayr had crashed, and they had retreated there to try and get some money doing various jobs. And so that is the end of the story of our last Kirkcudbright Smuggling Company. There is further reading. All these 4 books actually have a lot of the information that I've been talking about tonight, but most significantly of all, and you've got Contraband Cargo on your website, so you do know about the documentary films. And we're hoping very much to make a documentary film of Kirkcudbright Smuggling Companies in 2027 or 2028. And there have been leaps and bounds since Contraband Cargo, and this film will be a completely different animal. Thank you.